In 1935, two brothers from the Bronx bought 38 acres on a cliff in New Jersey for $450,000. In 1971, one of those brothers, the only one still alive, sold the same 38 acres for $12.5 million. Same cliff, same view. The view was always the problem, because the thing that made Palisades Amusement Park the most famous outdoor attraction in the New York metropolitan area was the same thing that made the land worth more without it: a straight, unobstructed sight line across the Hudson River to the Manhattan skyline. Every roller coaster rider who screamed coming down the Cyclone was screaming against a backdrop that real estate developers would eventually price at $329,000 an acre. The park didn't die because people stopped coming. In its peak year, 1969, 10 million people walked through its gates. It died because the view from the top of those cliffs was worth more as apartment windows than as the backdrop to a wooden roller coaster. And the man who held on longest, Irving Rosenthal, a Russian immigrant with no children, no heirs, and no willingness to let go, spent the last years of his life watching the numbers climb until even love couldn't outbid the market. But that ending came 73 years after the beginning, and the beginning was nothing more than a trolley company trying to fill empty seats. In 1898, automobiles were still a curiosity, and the Bergen County Traction Company had a problem. Their trolley line ran along the top of the New Jersey Palisades, a wall of volcanic rock rising 200 feet above the Hudson River, stretching 13 miles from Fort Lee north into New York State. And while the route was scenic, ridership dropped off sharply on evenings and weekends. Nobody needed to commute on a Sunday. So the traction company did what transit operators all over the country were doing at the turn of the century. They built something at the end of the line worth riding to. They cleared a grove of trees on the cliff's edge, near the boundary between the boroughs of Cliffside Park and Fort Lee, set out picnic tables, and called it the Park on the Palisades. It was crude, a few benches, a view, some shade, but the view was extraordinary. From the picnic grove, you could see the full northern sweep of Manhattan, the Harlem River, the new bridges going up, the whole roaring engine of the century's greatest city laid out across a mile of water. People rode the trolley just to sit on that cliff and look. The trolley park, and it was hardly the only one in America, at their peak there were hundreds, from Willow Grove in Pennsylvania to Electric Park in Kansas City, existed for no grander reason than to sell 5-cent tickets on a rail line that would otherwise sit idle on weekends. By 1908, the trolley company had added a Ferris wheel, a baby parade, and an attraction that seems barely credible now: diving horses. Horses that climbed a ramp and plunged into a pool of water while spectators watched. The park was sold that year to two men named August Newman and Frank Knox, who hired a manager named Alvin Dexter to bring in more attractions. But Newman and Knox were small-time operators, and the park's real transformation required a different kind of ambition entirely. It required the Shank brothers. Nicholas and Joseph Shank were Russian-Jewish immigrants who had come to New York in the 1890s from Rybinsk, a river city northeast of Moscow. They started by selling newspapers on the streets to supplement the family income, graduated to running a drugstore in Chinatown, which they owned outright by 1901, and then, in the way that only the early 20th century allowed, jumped sideways into the amusement business. One summer day, they took a trolley ride to Fort George in Upper Manhattan and noticed that thousands of people were standing around with nothing to do, waiting for the return trains. The Shanks saw idle crowds the way other men saw gold deposits. They rented a beer concession and started putting on vaudeville shows. Within a few years, they had built Fort George Amusement Park on the spot, what they called Paradise Park, and attracted the attention of Marcus Lowe, a theater operator who would become one of the founders of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Lowe set up a scenic railway concession at their park, and, impressed by the brothers' instinct for extracting dollars from crowds, offered them partnerships in several of his theatrical ventures, starting with the acquisition of the Lyric Theater in Hoboken. In 1910, the Shanks used Lowe's backing to purchase the park on the Palisades. They renamed it Shank Brothers Palisade Park. The Shanks were not men who thought small. In 1912, they built what they advertised as the largest saltwater pool in the nation, a concrete basin 400 feet by 600 feet, filled by pumping water from the saline Hudson River 200 feet below. Behind the waterfalls were enormous pontoons that rose and fell on rotation, creating artificial waves, making it one of the earliest wave pools in America. The pool alone could hold thousands of swimmers. On a hot Saturday in July, it did. Meanwhile, the Shanks were parlaying their amusement earnings into something much bigger. Joseph moved to Hollywood and married Norma Talmadge, one of the biggest film stars of the silent era. Nicholas stayed in New York and became Marcus Lowe's right-hand man, eventually running Lowe's Incorporated, the parent company of MGM. By 1927, the two brothers were reportedly worth $20 million combined, with a yearly income of at least $1 million. Nicholas Shank was, by some estimates, the 8th richest person in the United States during the 1930s. The amusement park on the cliff was a side venture now, a remnant from the era before they became moguls. They had bigger things to tend to. And so, in 1934, they leased it out, and in 1935, they sold it for $450,000 to Jack and Irving Rosenthal. That price deserves a pause. The Shanks had owned the park for a quarter century. They had built the pool, added dozens of rides, turned it into a destination so popular that by the 1920s, the nearby borough of Palisades Park, a separate municipality, considered changing its name because people kept confusing it with the amusement park. And they let it go for less than $500,000. In fairness, it was the middle of the Depression. But the sale also reflected how the Shanks valued the property. It was a sideshow, literally and figuratively, to their motion picture empire. They had moved on. The Rosenthals had not. Jack and Irving Rosenthal were Bronx boys, born in Russia, raised on East 175th Street by their widowed mother, Jenny, alongside half a dozen siblings, Abraham, Florence, Rebecca, Molly, Samuel, Celia, and more. The household was crowded and poor. Irving had enrolled at NYU's College of Dentistry, of all things, before the pull of the entertainment business proved stronger than the pull of molars. He never practiced a day of dentistry in his life. The brothers made their first fortune as concessionaires at Coney Island, where they operated games and food stands, and in 1927 built the Coney Island Cyclone, a wooden roller coaster that still operates today, nearly 100 years later. They also ran concessions and a carousel at Savin Rock Amusement Park in West Haven, Connecticut. And Irving operated a boxing arena called Golden City Park in Canarsie, Brooklyn, where the debut fights of Tony Canzonieri and Canada Lee took place. These were men who understood crowds. They understood what made people line up, pay money, and come back the next weekend. When they took over Palisades in 1935, the park was in rough shape. A fire that same year destroyed part of the midway, marooning 50 children who had to be rescued. The Rosenthals rebuilt. Then, on August 13, 1944, a far worse fire tore through the park on a brutally hot day, the fourth straight day of record-breaking heat, when an estimated 25,000 people were packed inside. Just 2 days earlier, a fire had destroyed much of Luna Park at Coney Island, and now the flames had jumped, metaphorically, across the Hudson. The blaze started at the Virginia Reel ride and consumed it. The fire moved fast through the park's wooden structures. These were old buildings, the kind that had been patched and repainted and wired and rewired over decades. 6 people died, all of them young, 3 boys and 3 girls, and 125 more were injured. People scaled fences to escape. Ambulances arrived from as far away as Jersey City. Firemen from 18 municipalities answered the alarm, including departments from Teaneck, Englewood Cliffs, and North Bergen. A Fort Lee fire engine caught fire itself while pumping water. 4,000 bathers had to be evacuated from the saltwater pool area alone. The park closed for the rest of the season. Here is where the Rosenthals showed what they were made of. Despite wartime rationing of building materials, they secured permits to rebuild on the grounds that the park was essential recreation for soldiers on leave. By the start of the 1945 season, the park was open again. One of the many attractions rebuilt by their construction superintendent, Joe McKee, was the Skyrocket roller coaster, which the Rosenthals rechristened the Cyclone, borrowing the name from the coaster they had built at Coney Island. It would become the park's signature ride, a wooden beast whose click, click, click up the first hill, followed by the silence at the top and the screaming plunge down, was audible for blocks. From Manhattan, if you looked across the river on a clear night, you could see the silhouette of the Cyclone's superstructure against the sky above the Palisades. The Rosenthals understood something that most amusement park operators of their era did not. The real money was not in the gate. Palisades charged for each ride individually, not for admission. Free admission was everywhere, printed on matchbook covers, clipped from comic book ads, handed out at gas stations. Parking was free, too. Irving Rosenthal's logic was simple. If you got people inside the gates without charging them, they would spend their money on rides and food and games. He was right, and he took the principle further than anyone expected. There was a hole in the fence behind the music stage, well known to every kid in the neighborhood. Local children used it to sneak into the park without paying. The Rosenthals knew about it. They never fixed it. Irving, who had no children of his own, instructed security to ignore anyone who came through. His reasoning was that a kid who got in for free was a kid who would spend his last dime on the Cyclone. In 1950, the Rosenthals met an Irish immigrant named Morgan Mickey Hughes, who operated a ride called the Rotor, a German-invented cylinder that spun so fast its riders stuck to the walls when the floor dropped away. The Rosenthals booked the Rotor and struck a deal that was pure genius on both sides. Mickey would import the newest European rides and debut them at Palisades. American amusement park operators could come see the rides in action and book them for their own parks. The Rosenthals got the rides for free. They were essentially running a showroom. Mickey got a cut of every sale and became the nation's largest importer of amusement park rides. The arrangement kept Palisades perpetually stocked with attractions that no other American park had. It was a competitive advantage that cost the Rosenthals nothing. Then came the advertising blitz, and if the Mickey Hughes deal showed Irving's genius for operations, the advertising showed his genius for psychology. Irving Rosenthal owned an advertising company called Action Ads Incorporate, and he used it the way a general uses an Air Force. He plastered the backs of comic books with ads for Palisades, clip-out coupons good for one free ride, printed in the pages of every superhero title that the largest concentration of comic book readers in the country, the children of the New York metropolitan area, were devouring. He put ads on matchbook covers, on billboards he called three-sheeters all over New York City, on radio stations. And then, in 1960, his wife wrote a jingle. Gladys Shelley was not a typical amusement park owner's wife. She was a songwriter of genuine professional stature, a Columbia University-educated lyricist who had written over 300 songs, including How Did He Look?, a ballad recorded by more than 100 singers that launched Edie Gourmet's career. During World War II, she wrote Bundles for Britain, which Gertrude Lawrence recorded for the war effort. She had collaborated with Fred Astaire, and in 1960 she sat down and wrote what may have been the most effective 7 seconds of advertising in the history of New Jersey. Palisades has the rides. Palisades has the fun. Come on over. The jingle aired on radio and television stations across the tri-state area constantly for 11 years, until every child within 100 miles could sing it from memory. Come on over became the park's official slogan, and the phrase was so embedded in the regional consciousness that people who never set foot in the park could hum the tune decades later. The park by the early 60s had between 45 and 50 rides in any given season, and they changed year to year. The Funhouse, the Tunnel of Love, the Flight to Mars simulator, the Wild Mouse roller coaster that construction superintendent Joe McKee and his foreman Bert Whitworth built in 1958, the atomic boats, the Rocco plane, the Ferris wheel with its 24 enclosed gondolas rising high enough to see clear past the George Washington Bridge. And then there were the French fries. Palisades French fries were legendary, soaked in malt vinegar, not ketchup, sold at stands that were originally called potato chip stands, and recalled decades later with a fervor that suggested they were more important than any ride in the park. The vinegar fries were as much a part of the Palisades identity as the Cyclone itself. 2 years after the jingle hit the airwaves, the park received a second, even more improbable boost. Chuck Barris, who would later become famous as the creator and host of The Gong Show, was at the time a young songwriter working at ABC. He had written a song about a generic amusement park and needed a name for it. One night, he was standing in Manhattan and looked across the Hudson at the cliffs where the park sat, its lights blazing against the dark Jersey sky. He added the name and gave the song to Freddy Cannon, a rock and roll singer from Massachusetts whose nickname was Boom Boom. Swan Records released Palisades Park as a B-side, the throwaway track on the back of a single called June, July, and August. Nobody at the label expected anything from it. Then a disc jockey in Flint, Michigan played it by mistake, and the song took off. By the last week of June 1962, Palisades Park sat at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. It became the biggest hit of Freddy Cannon's career. The Beach Boys later covered it. Bruce Springsteen performed it on tour. And for the park, it was a kind of advertising that money could not buy. A nationally charting rock and roll song that was, in effect, a 1-minute and 53-second commercial, complete with the sound effects of screaming roller coaster riders and a calliope playing Entrance of the Gladiators. The song listed the rides by name: Shoot the Chute, Rocket Ship, Roller Coaster, Loop the Loop, Merry-Go-Round, Tunnel of Love, Ferris Wheel. And its narrative was irresistible. A boy takes a walk after dark, discovers the park, meets a girl, and falls in love. It was every summer night compressed into 2 minutes. The mid-50s and 60s were the glory years. Rock and roll shows at the open-air music pavilion, hosted by local radio stars Clay Cole and cousin Brucey Morrow, drew Motown acts and pop stars and enormous crowds. Tony Bennett came and was forced, against his will, to lip-sync I Left My Heart in San Francisco on faulty equipment. The record skipped, playing Cisco, Cisco, Cisco on a loop, and Bennett never forgave Cousin Brucey. The Rolling Stones made one of their first American public appearances on Clay Cole's show at Palisades. The Jackson 5 performed there. Diana Ross and the Supremes, Frankie Avalon, Tony Orlando, who was 16 years old and came with his mother and his entire family. The park was dubbed the beauty pageant capital of the world. It hosted the Miss American Teenager pageant and the Little Miss America pageant for girls aged 5 to 10, both televised on WPIX Channel 11. Gladys Shelley wrote the theme song for Little Miss America, too. She was a one-woman content factory for the park, and nobody seemed to mind that the songwriter and the park owner shared a bedroom. From 1947 to 1971, Palisades averaged 6 million visitors a year. 6 million visitors a year, and that was just the average. In 1969, attendance hit 10 million, an almost inconceivable number for a 38-acre park that had no hotel, no multi-day pass, no branded franchise characters. 10 million people in a single season, nearly all of them arriving by car, on roads designed for a quiet pair of Bergen County boroughs that had never asked to become the entertainment capital of the northeastern United States. This is where the view starts to turn. Not the view of Manhattan, that never changed. The view from the neighborhoods surrounding the park, because 6 million visitors a year meant 6 million arrivals and 6 million departures, and the overwhelming majority of them came by car. The park's on-site parking lot was inadequate, and as attendance grew, it filled up earlier and earlier in the day. The Rosenthals opened an overflow lot at the bottom of the cliff in Edgewater, running shuttle buses up the 200-foot rise to the park. But even that lot filled up. When it did, motorists were directed to park on residential streets anywhere from the George Washington Bridge to the Lincoln Tunnel, a stretch of several miles. The streets of Fort Lee and Cliffside Park became, every weekend from Easter to Labor Day, an unpaid parking lot for the amusement industry. Residents could not find spaces in front of their own homes. Traffic backed up for blocks. The noise carried. The litter accumulated. And the composition of the crowds was changing. This was the era when those complaints carried a particular subtext, and it would be dishonest not to mention it. The park had an ugly history on race. In 1946, the Rosenthals formed something called the Sun and Surf Club and restricted pool access to members only, a transparent device for barring black swimmers in violation of New Jersey civil rights law. White visitors who were not members were routinely admitted and handed membership cards inside. Black visitors were turned away. In July 1947, a 22-year-old African-American woman named Melba Vale tried to use a pool ticket borrowed from a white friend and was, as newspapers at the time reported, forcibly dragged and ejected from the park. The Congress of Racial Equality organized protests at the entrance. 11 Corps members were arrested. Flyers circulated, "Don't get cool at Palisades Pool." The segregation policy was dropped in the 1950s, but the damage to the park's moral standing was done. And by the 1960s, when residents complained about the changing demographics of the crowds, the racial dimension was impossible to miss. The neighbors wanted the park gone. They wanted quiet streets and empty parking spaces and property values unencumbered by 6 million annual visitors. And they had an ally that no amusement park could defeat, the zoning board. In 1967, the property was rezoned from amusement use to permit high-rise residential development. The towns of Fort Lee and Cliffside Park had done what residents demanded. They had changed the rules of the game so that the land could no longer legally be used for what it had been used for since 1898. Developers began circling. They could see what anyone with a calculator could see. 38 acres on top of a cliff overlooking Manhattan, minutes from the George Washington Bridge, in an era when high-rise apartment living was booming across the New York suburbs. This was among the most valuable undeveloped residential land in the metropolitan area. The only thing standing in the way was a 72-year-old man who loved roller coasters more than he loved money. Irving Rosenthal, who during the park's heyday had referred to Fort Lee as his town, refused to sell. His brother Jack had died of Parkinson's disease in 1967, the same year the rezoning went through. A cruel coincidence that left Irving as sole owner at the precise moment when the legal ground beneath the park shifted. He had no children. He had no heir. He was aging, and everyone knew it. Developers made offers. Irving turned them down. The towns threatened eminent domain, condemnation of the property for redevelopment. Irving held on. He had spent 32 years building this place, 32 years since he and Jack scraped together $450,000 in the middle of the Depression to buy a burned-out amusement park from 2 movie moguls who had outgrown it. He had rebuilt it after 2 fires. He had turned it into the most visited amusement park in the region. He had let children sneak in through a hole in the fence. He had hired his wife to write the jingle. He had made Fort Lee famous. And now, Fort Lee wanted him gone. The math was relentless, and it deserves to be understood, because this is the math that killed the park. Not nostalgia, not racism, not traffic, though all of those played their parts. The park operated seasonally, roughly Easter to Labor Day, 5 months at best. And while it generated substantial revenue during those months, the land beneath it was generating nothing for the other 7 months of the year. A high-rise apartment building generates revenue 12 months a year, every year, indefinitely. The property taxes on luxury condominiums would dwarf what the park contributed to municipal coffers. The traffic would be manageable, residents, not crowds. The view of Manhattan, which the park used as a free backdrop for screaming teenagers, could be sold as the primary amenity of every apartment on every upper floor. The economics were irrefutable. The only variable was Irving. By 1970, Irving Rosenthal was 75 years old. His brother had been dead for 3 years. His wife, Gladys, was still writing songs, but had no interest in running an amusement park. The towns had rezoned his land. The developers had the law on their side. And Irving had no one to leave the park to. No son, no daughter, no nephew in the business, no protege who would carry on. The thing he had built would die with him regardless. The only question was whether it died while he was alive to watch or after. In January 1971, Irving Rosenthal accepted the inevitable. The Winston Towers Corporation, a Texas-based developer, acquired the 38-acre property for $12.5 million. The deal included one condition that Irving had insisted upon. The developer would lease the park back to him so that Palisades Amusement Park could operate for one final season. Winston Towers agreed. It was a small concession. They could afford to wait one summer. The 1971 season at Palisades must have been a strange thing. A summer-long wake for a place that was not yet dead. The rides still ran. The Cyclone still clicked its way up the first hill and plunged screaming down the other side. The saltwater pool still churned its mechanical waves. The vinegar fries still steamed in their paper cups. The jingle still played on the radio. Palisades has the rides. Palisades has the fun. Come on over. But everyone knew. The park's closing had been front-page news in the New York Times in January. Every visitor that spring and summer was, whether they acknowledged it or not, saying goodbye. The season wound down through August and into September. On Sunday, September 12, 1971, Palisades Amusement Park closed its gates for the last time. The last person to swim in the world's largest outdoor saltwater pool was a young man named Kurt Kellinger, the son of the park's longtime pool manager. What happened next was fast and irreversible. Mickey Hughes, the same Irish ride operator who had imported all those European rides for the Rosenthals and who had become like family to the park, teamed up with a man named Fletch Creamer, Jr. in a last-ditch effort to reopen for one more season. They managed to secure a lease from Winston Towers, which was not yet ready to begin construction. But when they applied to the town of Fort Lee for a business license, the answer was no. Fort Lee would not issue one until the following spring at the earliest, and even then could make no guarantee. Think about what that means. The town that had hosted the park for over 60 years would not even allow one more summer. The rezoning had been the whole point. Letting the park reopen, even temporarily, would have undercut the entire rationale for the zoning change. Fort Lee was not going to let the park come back. The buildings were demolished. The rides were sold, dismantled, and shipped to amusement parks across the United States and Canada. The famous carousel ended up in Canada, where it still operates. The Cyclone's 5 original roller coaster cars were hauled to a barn in Pennsylvania, where they gathered dust for more than 40 years before being returned to Bergen County in 2014 for a planned restoration. The towns of Cliffside Park and Fort Lee briefly considered salvaging one piece of the old park for public use, the enormous saltwater swimming pool. They investigated turning it into a municipal recreation facility. But when engineers went to examine it, they found that vandals had damaged the filtration system beyond repair. The pool, the great pool, the 400 by 600-foot ocean in the sky, The pool that had pumped the Hudson River 200 feet uphill since 1912 was gone. Winston Santek's moved fast. By 1974, the first tower was complete, a 31-story concrete slab at 300 Winston Drive containing 676 units. A second tower went up at 200 Winston Drive. Then came Carlisle Towers in Cliffside Park. Then the Royal Buckingham in Fort Lee. 4 luxury high-rise apartment buildings, 1,000-plus units, standing on the exact ground where the Cyclone once rattled, and the Tunnel of Love once floated couples into the dark, and Irving Rosenthal once watched children crawl through a hole in his fence and did nothing about it. The apartments advertised the same thing the park once offered for free: stunning views of the Hudson River and the New York City skyline. Irving Rosenthal did not live long after the park closed. He continued working as chairman of his advertising firm and stayed involved in real estate and amusement developments. But on December 27, 1973, a Thursday, 2 years and 3 months after the last rider climbed off the last ride, Irving Rosenthal died of a heart attack at his home in Manhattan. He was 78 years old. His wife, Gladys Shelley, the songwriter who had written Come On Over, survived him by 30 years, dying in 2003 at the age of 91. The numbers tell one story. The park was bought for $450,000, and the land was sold for $12.5 million, a return of nearly 28 times the original investment over 36 years. That is a spectacular real estate outcome by any measure. The condominiums that replaced the park generate millions in property tax revenue annually for Cliffside Park and Fort Lee. The traffic problems vanished. The litter vanished. The noise vanished. By every metric that a municipal budget cares about, the deal was a success. But numbers are not the only story, and the people who lived through this know it. The park was not just an economic unit. It was the place where Tony Orlando went with his mother when he was 16. It was the place where Freddy Cannon's song played on the Midway speakers the summer it went to number 3. It was the place where Cousin Brucey made Tony Bennett lip-sync on broken equipment and never lived it down. It was the place where Melba Vale was dragged out of a swimming pool for the color of her skin, and where Corps members marched at the entrance holding signs that read, "Protest Jim Crow." It was the place where a child could crawl through a hole in a fence and find a world of noise and light and centrifugal force waiting on the other side, and where the owner of that world had decided, deliberately and with some tenderness, to let the hole stay. Sol Abrams, who served as the park's vice president and chief of public relations from 1949 through the final day in 1971, 22 years of promoting a place that in the end did not need to be promoted so much as protected, later said simply, "I'm glad to see so many old-time friends." He was speaking at a Fort Lee Museum event decades later, and the understatement said everything. The park enters and re-enters American culture in ways its owners never imagined. In the 1945 film The Clock, the lights of the roller coaster are visible across the Hudson, while young lovers wait for a bus on Riverside Drive. In West Side Story, an ad for Palisades is painted on the wall outside Doc's soda shop. In Mad Men, Don Draper carries his sleeping daughter to bed, and the child is holding a pink helium balloon that reads, Palisades Amusement Park. In Watchmen, Dr. Manhattan stares at an old photograph taken there. In The Many Saints of Newark, the Sopranos prequel, Palisades Park plays on the radio of a taxi. The park is a ghost that keeps appearing in the mirrors of mid-century American storytelling, always in the background, always as a marker of a particular kind of American innocence, the kind that smells like vinegar-soaked French fries and sounds like a wooden roller coaster gaining speed. In 1998, on the centennial of the park's opening, the management of Winston Towers dedicated a small monument on their property. It is called the Little Park of Memories. The names of the old rides are inscribed on its bricks. It sits on the edge of the Palisades in the shadow of a 31-story condominium tower. And if you stand there and look east, you can see exactly what the picnickers saw in 1898, and what the Shank brothers saw in 1910, and what Irving Rosenthal saw every summer for 36 years. The island of Manhattan, filling the horizon, growing taller, growing richer, growing closer, until finally it reached across the river and took the cliff for itself. The view has not changed. That was always the point. The view from the top of the Palisades was the most valuable thing about the park, and the most valuable thing about the park was, in the end, the thing that was not the park at all. It was the geography. It was the accident of volcanic geology that thrust a wall of diabase rock 200 feet above a tidal river directly across from the greatest city on Earth. The Trolley Company saw it in 1898 and tried to sell picnic lunches. The Shanks saw it in 1910 and tried to sell swimming and roller coasters. The Rosenthals saw it in 1935 and tried to sell joy. The developers saw it in 1967 and tried to sell apartments. They were all selling the same thing, the view of Manhattan. And the apartments, it turned out, were the best way to sell it, because an apartment lets you own a piece of the view permanently, not for a Saturday afternoon, not for the price of a ride ticket, but every morning when you open your curtains. The Cyclone is gone, the saltwater pool is gone, the hole in the fence is gone, Irving Rosenthal is gone, Gladys Shelley is gone. The jingle plays now only in the memories of people who were young when it aired, and those people are in their 70s and 80s. On a summer night, if you stand on Riverside Drive in Manhattan and look west across the Hudson, you can see the top of the Palisades, and where there were once lights, the garish, spinning, blinking lights of a midway at full throttle, there are now the steady, rectangular lights of apartment windows stacked 31 stories high, each one framing the same view that started all of this, only now the view is pointed in the other direction.